The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it wept. It streaked down the bedroom window like tears on dirty glass, casting long, wavering shadows across the floorboards. Elizabeth Turner stood perfectly still in the doorway, listening to the rhythm of the storm outside and the soft, steady breathing of the boy inside. Samuel. He was 7 years old, curled into a tight ball beneath a blanket patterned with cartoon astronauts. One small arm hung over the edge of the mattress. His fingers relaxed in deep sleep. Elizabeth stepped quietly into the room, her movements completely devoid of sound. It wasn't a conscious effort, it was muscle memory. The same silent gait that had kept her alive in the dusty, blood-soaked alleyways of Fallujah and the freezing, unlit corridors of black sites in Eastern Europe now served only to keep her from waking her son. She gently lifted his arm and tucked it back under the warmth of the quilt. Her hand brushed against his cheek. His skin was so warm, so flawlessly soft. It was a staggering contrast to her own hands, calloused, rough, scarred by burn marks and shrapnel. For a fleeting second, the scent of rain was replaced by the phantom smell of cordite and copper. The memories tried to claw their way up her throat, but she forced them down, locking them back in the dark vault at the back of her mind. "You are safe," she told herself, the mantra silent but desperate. "He is safe. It's over." Elizabeth lingered for another minute, letting the sheer innocence of her son wash over her, anchoring her to humanity. Then, she turned and slipped out of the room, leaving the door cracked open exactly 2 inches. Enough to hear him, enough to reach him in a fraction of a second if the world suddenly shattered. She walked down the narrow hallway of their suburban home. The house was modest, unassuming, a beige siding, a slightly overgrown front lawn, a minivan in the driveway. It was the perfect camouflage. No one looking at Elizabeth Turner, the quiet, polite woman who worked as a freelance data analyst and brought store-bought cupcakes to PTA meetings, would ever guess she had once been one of the most lethal assets in the United States Army intelligence support activity. Downstairs, the kitchen was bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of a single overhead bulb. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Elizabeth poured herself a cup of black coffee, the liquid thick and bitter, just the way she needed it to stay sharp. She carried the mug to the dining table, which was currently serving as her makeshift desk. On the table lay a single, battered manila folder. It had arrived 2 days ago in a plain brown envelope with no return address. The postmark was from Washington, D.C. Elizabeth hadn't opened it immediately. Every instinct she had honed over a decade of black ops intelligence told her that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. But curiosity, the fatal flaw of every good investigator, had finally won. She sat down, the wooden chair creaking softly beneath her weight. She took a sip of the scalding coffee, welcoming the burn, and opened the folder. Inside was a police file. A cold case. Specifically, the murder of a man named Marcus Vance. Dated exactly 5 years ago. Marcus hadn't been a soldier. He was an investigative journalist. A man with a dangerous penchant for digging into classified government spending. Officially, the Seattle Police Department had ruled his death a robbery gone wrong. He was found in a damp alley behind a dive bar, his wallet missing, a single fatal stab wound to the chest. Tragic, but in a city this size, entirely unremarkable. The case had grown cold, buried under a mountain of newer, louder tragedies. But someone had sent this file to Elizabeth. Someone knew who she was, where she lived, and what she could do. She spread the crime scene photographs across the table. They were grainy, poorly lit, taken by a patrol cop who likely just wanted to end his shift. There was Marcus, slumped against a brick wall, his trench coat soaked in dark, viscous blood. Elizabeth's eyes trained to spot a sniper's hide in a bustling market or an IED wire in a pile of trash, scanned the photos. She wasn't looking at the body. She was looking at the periphery. The angles, the shadows. "Why me, Marcus?" she whispered into the empty room. "What did you find?" She turned to the autopsy report. Single puncture wound. Entry between the third and fourth ribs. Upward trajectory. Pierced the left ventricle. Death was instantaneous. Elizabeth frowned. Her fingers traced the typed words. An upward thrust between the ribs. Precise and powerful enough to bypass the sternum and strike the heart directly. That wasn't the sloppy, panicked strike of a street mugger looking for drug money. That was a kinetic, calculated termination. That was a professional. She reached for the final photograph in the stack. It was a close-up of the alley floor, focused on a shattered piece of glass from a broken beer bottle near Marcus's boot. The police had likely taken it to document the scene's debris. Elizabeth leaned in closer. Her heart rate, normally a steady 60 beats per minute, spiked to 80. In the curvature of the broken glass, catching the dim yellow light of a distant street lamp, was a reflection. It was warped, distorted, but to Elizabeth, it was as clear as a confession. It was the reflection of the killer's boots and the lower half of his right leg as he walked away from the body. But it wasn't the boot that made the air freeze in her lungs. It was what was strapped to the side of the killer's calf. A tactical combat knife sheath, custom kydex, and tied around the base of the sheath, dangling like a morbid talisman, was a very specific braid of 550 paracord, black, interweaved with a single thread of crimson. Elizabeth's breath hitched. The coffee mug slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the table, spilling hot, dark liquid across the police report. She didn't notice. Her entire universe had just collapsed into that single, warped reflection. Echo 6. That was the call sign of her old covert strike team, a ghost unit that didn't exist on any official Pentagon roster. There were only 8 of them, 8 operators who had bled together, killed together, and supposedly disbanded together when a mission in Damascus went catastrophically wrong, leaving 2 of their own dead and the rest scattered to the winds. The crimson and black paracord braid was their unofficial insignia. They all wore it. Marcus Vance wasn't killed by a mugger. He was assassinated by a member of Elizabeth's own former team. The silence of the house suddenly felt suffocating. The shadows in the corners of the kitchen seemed to lengthen, reaching out toward her. If a member of Echo 6 was active, if they had killed a journalist in her city, and if someone had sent her the file, it meant the past wasn't dead. It was hunting her. A sudden, sharp beep shattered the silence. Elizabeth whipped her head around. It was her phone, resting on the kitchen counter. The screen illuminated, casting a pale blue glow over the spilled coffee. It was an alert from the discreet, military-grade perimeter sensors she had buried in her yard. Motion detected. Sector 4. Backyard gate. For 2 seconds, Elizabeth Turner, the mother who baked cupcakes and helped with math homework, was completely paralyzed by a terror so profound it tasted like ash. If they were here, they weren't here for a reunion. They were here to clean up loose ends. and Samuel was sleeping just 15 feet above her head. The paralysis vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. The mother disappeared. The soldier woke up. Elizabeth didn't run. Running made noise. She slid across the kitchen floor in her socks, her eyes fixed on the digital display of the security feed. A shadow, moving with disciplined fluidity, was slipping past the rosebushes. She reached beneath the false bottom of the kitchen island cabinet. Her hand bypassed the baking sheets and wrapped around the cold, textured grip of a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP compact. She chambered around with a soft, metallic snick that felt like an old friend whispering a greeting. The rain lashed aggressively against the back door. The doorknob began to turn. Slowly, silently. Elizabeth raised the weapon, centering the sights on the center of the wooden door. Her breathing slowed to a tactical, rhythmic crawl. Let them come. They thought they were hunting a ghost. They were about to find out that a cornered mother is the most dangerous force in nature. God forgive me, she whispered into the dark, her finger resting gently on the trigger. Because I won't. The lock disengaged with a microscopic click, a sound so soft it would have been entirely swallowed by the thunder. Had Elizabeth not been waiting for it, the back door swung inward, bringing with it a violent gust of wind and the smell of ozone and wet asphalt. A shadow detached itself from the storm and stepped into the kitchen. He moved with the practiced, predatory grace of a Tier 1 operator. He wore non-reflective black tactical gear, water streaming off his shoulders, his face obscured by a neoprene mask and dual-tube night vision goggles. In his hands, held in a tight, compressed ready position, was a suppressed MP7 submachine gun. He swept the barrel across the room, slicing the pie, clearing the corners, but he made one critical, fatal error. He expected his target to be asleep upstairs, or at best, cowering behind a counter. He didn't expect the target to be hunting him. Elizabeth didn't shoot. Gunfire, even suppressed, was too loud. It would shatter the fragile bubble of safety around Samuel upstairs. Instead, she lunged from the blind spot behind the refrigerator. She moved like a coiled spring released in the dark. In 2 silent, explosive strides, she closed the distance. Her left hand struck out, gripping the hot suppressor of the MP7 and shoving the barrel violently upward toward the ceiling. Simultaneously, the heavy steel frame of her Heckler & Koch slammed directly into the side of the intruder's helmet with a sickening crack. The man grunted, his knees buckling slightly, but his training kicked in. He let go of the primary weapon, letting it drop on its tactical sling, and drove a vicious elbow backward toward Elizabeth's face. She anticipated the strike, slipping beneath it and sweeping his lead leg. The intruder crashed onto the linoleum floor, taking a kitchen chair down with him in a clatter of wood. Before he could draw the combat knife strapped to his thigh, the same custom Kydex sheath from the photograph, Elizabeth was on top of him. She pinned his right arm with her knee, her full weight pressing down on his chest, and jammed the muzzle of her USP tightly under his chin, right where the neoprene mask ended. Blink, and I'll paint the ceiling with your memories, Elizabeth hissed, her voice a terrifying, barely audible whisper. The intruder froze. His breathing was heavy, ragged. Slowly, deliberately, Elizabeth used her free hand to rip the night vision goggles and mask off his face. The dim light from the open door illuminated his features. He was older now, the lines around his eyes deepened by years of stress. but the rugged jaw and the jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow were unmistakable. "Jackson," Elizabeth breathed, shock momentarily piercing her cold fury. Elias Jackson, Echo 6, a communications and logistics specialist. The man who had patched her up in a bombed-out basement in Kandahar when a piece of shrapnel had torn through her shoulder. Jackson coughed, a wet, rattling sound. He didn't look like a hitman. He looked terrified. "Lizzie," he gasped, his eyes wide. "You're still too damn fast. Why are you in my house?" "Elias?" She didn't move the gun. Trust was a luxury she had discarded 5 years ago. "Did you send the file on Vance? Are you here to finish what you started in that alley?" "I didn't kill Vance," Jackson rasped, struggling to breathe under her weight. "I swear to God, Lizzie, I came to warn you." Vance found the Damascus ledger. He found out what really happened to the $2 million in gold. And who sold us out to the ambush. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. The Damascus operation, the mission that had broken Echo 6. They had been told it was a rescue op. But it turned out to be an ambush. 2 dead operators. And now, Jackson was saying it wasn't a tactical error. It was treason. "Who?" she demanded. "The director," Jackson whispered, his eyes darting toward the open door. "Watching the storm. He's wiping the board, cleaning up loose ends before his Senate confirmation hearing. Marcus Vance got too close. They killed him, framed it as a mugging. Then they started hunting the surviving members of Echo 6. Miller is dead. Reyes is dead. I'm next." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed. "If you're running, why come here? You brought them to my door." "I didn't have a choice." Jackson groaned. Suddenly, his body convulsed, and he gripped his side. For the first time, Elizabeth noticed the dark stain spreading across his tactical vest. He hadn't been breathing heavily from the fight. He had been shot before he even arrived. "They tracked my burner car," Jackson choked out, his skin turning a sickly shade of gray. "I tried to lose them on the interstate. Lizzie, listen to me. They know about your new life. They know about the boy." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. The world tilted on its axis. "Samuel. How far behind you are they?" Her voice was devoid of emotion now, completely hollowed out by absolute necessity. 2 minutes, Jackson whispered, his eyes starting to lose their focus. "Maybe less. It's a cleanup crew. 4 men, heavily armed. You can't fight them all. Lizzie, you have to run. Take the boy and run." He reached into his vest with trembling fingers and pulled out a small, blood-smeared thumb drive. "Vance's files. The proof. Take it." Elizabeth grabbed the drive, shoving it into her pocket. She looked down at the man who had once saved her life. He was dying on her kitchen floor, bleeding out over the linoleum she had just mopped that morning. The absurdity of it all threatened to crush her. But she walled off the panic. "I'm sorry, Elias," she whispered. "Just keep him safe," Jackson murmured, his eyes drifting shut. "Keep the kid safe." He exhaled one last time, his body going completely slack. Elizabeth didn't have the luxury of mourning. She had exactly 90 seconds. She sprinted upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time, her footfalls completely silent. She burst into Samuel's room. The boy was still fast asleep, oblivious to the violence that had just stained his home. "Sammy," she whispered, gently but firmly shaking his shoulder. "Sammy, wake up, sweetheart." Samuel groaned, rubbing his eyes with small fists. "Mommy, is it morning?" "No, baby. Listen to me very carefully," Elizabeth said. her voice steady, projecting a calm she didn't feel. "We're going to play the silent game. Right now. You remember the rules?" Samuel blinked, still groggy, but he nodded slowly. They had practiced this. She had framed it as a game. A fun emergency drill for earthquakes or bad storms. But she had always known, deep down, why she was really training him. Rule number 1. No talking. The boy whispered. Rule number 2. Be invisible. "That's my brave boy." She pulled him out of bed, grabbing his sneakers and a warm jacket. "Put these on, quick as a mouse." While Samuel dressed, Elizabeth dropped to her knees and pulled a loose floorboard up from under his bed. Beneath it was a heavy canvas duffel bag. Her go bag, packed with forged passports, untraceable cash in 3 currencies, burner phones, and enough ammunition to start a small war. She slung it over her shoulder. She grabbed Samuel's hand. It was so small, so trusting. "Stay close to me," she whispered. They moved out of the room and down the stairs. As they reached the bottom, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the front of the house. Through the frosted glass of the front door, Elizabeth saw them. 3 black SUVs had just rolled to a silent stop on her front lawn. Their headlights cut. Dark figures were already spilling out, moving with terrifying synchronization toward the front porch. They were out of time. Elizabeth scooped Samuel into her arms, pressing his face into her neck so he wouldn't see Jackson's body on the floor. She darted through the kitchen, stepping over her fallen comrade, and slipped out the back door into the raging storm. The rain hit them like icy daggers. The wind howled, drowning out the sound of the front door being kicked off its hinges. Elizabeth Turner, the mother, vanished into the Seattle night, holding her entire world in her arms. But the soldier had been awakened, and the soldier was already planning her revenge. The storm was a tactical advantage. It blinded the thermal optics, swallowed the sound of snapping twigs, and washed away footprints before they could even form in the mud. To the men kicking down her front door, the Seattle rain was a miserable obstacle. To Elizabeth Turner, it was a cloak. She moved through the backyard with Samuel clutched tightly to her chest. His face was buried in the collar of her tactical jacket, his small hands gripping the wet fabric with desperate strength. He was shivering, not just from the biting cold, but from the raw, instinctual fear that radiates from adults when the world breaks apart. "I've got you, Sammy," she breathed into his hair, her voice an anchor in the chaotic night. "Mommy's right here. Keep playing the game." She reached the back fence, a tall cedar partition separating her modest yard from a narrow, unlit alleyway. A normal mother might have struggled to climb it with a 50-pound child in one arm and a heavy go bag over the other shoulder. Elizabeth didn't even break her stride. She used a heavy, overturned ceramic planter as a step, vaulted the top of the fence with a fluid, practiced motion, and landed softly in the muck of the alley. She crouched instantly, pulling Samuel into the deep shadow of a rusted dumpster. Through the heavy sheets of rain, the muffled shouts of the tactical team echoed from inside her house. They had found Elias Jackson's body. They would secure the perimeter within seconds. Elizabeth knew their playbook because she had helped write it. 4 men to breach, 1 man on the back door, and 1 man holding the perimeter in the alley to cut off any retreat. Where was the alley man? Elizabeth's eyes darted left and right, straining against the darkness. The street lamp at the end of the block was broken. She had shot it out with a silenced pellet gun 2 years ago. Specifically for a night like this. Then, She saw it, a faint, red pinpoint of light, glowing for a fraction of a second before vanishing. The glowing ember of a cigarette, instantly extinguished by a gloved hand. He was 50 yards down the alley, blocking their only exit to the main street. He was holding a suppressed assault rifle, sweeping his night vision optics across the trash cans. "Sammy," Elizabeth whispered, kneeling in the freezing mud so she was eye level with her son. She framed his wet face with her hands. "I need you to be the bravest you've ever been. Can you do that for me?" Samuel nodded, his bottom lip trembling. "I'm cold, Mommy." "I know, baby, I know." It broke her heart to see him like this. But the soldier in her locked the heartbreak away in a steel box. "I need you to sit right here behind this big green box. Do not move. Put your hands over your ears. Close your eyes tight, and count to 50, slowly, like we practice at hide and seek. When you open them, I'll be right back. Promise." "Okay," Samuel whimpered, pressing his back against the cold, wet metal of the dumpster, covering his ears with his small hands and squeezing his eyes shut. 1, 2, 3. Elizabeth stood up. The mother vanished into the shadows, leaving only the ghost of Echo 6 behind. She unholstered the Heckler & Koch USP. She didn't approach the guard from the center of the alley. She moved along the brick wall of the adjacent building, letting the water run off from the roof mask her footsteps. She was entirely completely silent, a phantom slipping between the raindrops. The operative in the alley was disciplined, scanning his sectors methodically, but he was looking for a panicked civilian running wildly into the night. Or at best, a rusty ex-soldier. He wasn't looking directly above him. Elizabeth climbed a stack of wooden shipping pallets next to a brick wall, elevating herself 6 feet off the ground. As the guard walked past her position, his rifle raised, she dropped. She landed perfectly behind him, before he could even register the shift in air pressure. Her left arm snaked around his throat in a flawless rear naked choke. Her right hand drove the heavy base of her pistol into the back of his skull, right at the brainstem. It wasn't a lethal blow. She didn't have time for the noise of a struggling, dying man, but it was enough to instantly short-circuit his nervous system. The operative went completely limp, his rifle clattering against Elizabeth's leg before she caught it mid-air to prevent it from hitting the pavement. She lowered his unconscious body to the ground, stripping him of his encrypted radio and tossing his weapon into a storm drain. It took exactly 12 seconds. She sprinted back to the dumpster. Samuel was still there, shivering, his hands clamped over his ears. 41, 42, 50. Elizabeth whispered softly, pulling his hands away and scooping him back into her arms. "Game over, sweetie. You won. Let's go get your prize." "What's the prize?" Samuel asked, his voice muffled against her neck as she hurried them down the alley, stepping over the unconscious guard without a second glance. "A road trip," she replied. They reached the end of the alley and crossed onto a quiet residential street. Elizabeth didn't go toward her minivan. It would have GPS trackers slapped on its undercarriage by now. Instead, she walked 3 blocks east, her heart hammering against her ribs, until they reached a dilapidated apartment complex. Parked in the guest lot, under a thick canopy of oak trees, was a 10-year-old Volvo station wagon. It was dusty, ordinary, and practically invisible. Elizabeth had bought it with cash under the name Sarah Jenkins 3 years ago. She paid a local teenager $20 a month to start the engine twice a week and keep the tires inflated. It was her insurance policy. Tonight, it was their lifeboat. She unlocked the car manually, ushering Samuel into the backseat and wrapping him in a thick wool blanket she kept stored in the trunk. "Buckle up, astronaut," she said, giving him a quick, reassuring smile that felt foreign on her lips. "Where are we going, Mommy?" "Somewhere safe." She climbed into the driver's seat, engaged the ignition, and the heavy engine roared to life. She didn't turn on the headlights until they were 4 miles away from the neighborhood. Merging onto the desolate, rain-slicked pavement of Interstate 5 South. The heater blasted, slowly thawing the ice in the cabin, but the chill in Elizabeth's veins remained. She drove with one hand on the steering wheel, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for black SUVs. With her free hand, she reached into her wet pocket and pulled out the blood-stained thumb drive Elias Jackson had given her. The Damascus Ledger. She placed the drive on the passenger seat. It felt as heavy as a block of lead. This small piece of plastic had cost Marcus Vance his life. It had cost Elias Jackson his life. And it had just destroyed the fragile, beautiful illusion of a normal life she had built for her son. The director. That's who Jackson had blamed. The director of the intelligence support activity. A man with the power to erase entire villages off the map. Let alone a single mother and her son. He was cleaning house for a Senate confirmation. He wanted absolute silence. And Elizabeth and her old teammates were the last remaining echoes of his sins. She glanced at the rearview mirror again. Samuel had fallen asleep, exhausted by the cold and the fear. His breathing returning to a steady, peaceful rhythm. A hardened resolve settled over Elizabeth. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. She had spent 5 years hiding, trying to forget the blood on her hands, trying to be just a mother who baked cupcakes. But you can't outrun a shadow. Eventually, you have to turn around and shoot it. You want to wipe the board, Director? Elizabeth whispered to the empty passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the dark highway ahead. Fine, but you just put my son in the crossfire. And now, I'm going to wipe you. The Volvo disappeared into the stormy night, leaving the ruins of Elizabeth Turner's life behind, and accelerating toward a war they thought they had already won. Dawn didn't break over the Pacific Northwest, it bled. It was a bruised, grayish-purple light that slowly seeped through the heavy cloud cover as the old Volvo crossed the border into Oregon. The relentless rain had faded into a persistent, miserable drizzle, slicking the asphalt like black ice. Elizabeth's hands were locked on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Her knuckles were white. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape from Seattle was beginning to crash, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But her mind was running at 1,000 miles an hour. She glanced in the rearview mirror. Samuel was sprawled across the backseat, wrapped in the scratchy wool blanket, his chest rising and falling in the deep, untroubled rhythm of childhood sleep. His cheek was pressed against the vinyl upholstery. He looked so incredibly fragile. I brought this to him. A dark voice whispered in the back of her mind. You thought you could walk away from the ghosts. But you just led them to your son. Elizabeth gripped the wheel tighter, aggressively shoving the guilt back into its box. Guilt was a luxury. Guilt slowed your reaction time. Right now, she needed to be a machine. She took the next exit. A forgotten stretch of road leading away from the interstate. 5 miles down a 2-lane highway flanked by towering pine trees. She found what she was looking for, the Starlight Motor Inn. It was a relic of the 1980s, boasting a flickering neon sign where the S and the T had long since burned out, leaving it to proclaim, "Arlight." It was perfect. No cameras in the parking lot. No digital registry. Just a tired-looking man behind bulletproof glass who didn't ask questions as long as the cash was green. Elizabeth paid for 2 nights in advance. Using $70 from her go bag, she asked for a room at the back, on the ground floor, facing the tree line, room 14. She parked the Volvo close to the door, popping the trunk before she gently woke Samuel. "Hey, Sammy, we're here," she whispered, unbuckling him. He rubbed his eyes, looking at the peeling yellow paint of the motel door and the damp, pine needle-covered parking lot. "Is this our vacation, Mommy?" Elizabeth forced a bright, reassuring smile. It felt like her face might crack. "It's our secret base, buddy. Remember the game? We're on a secret mission now." Samuel's eyes widened slightly, the fear from the night before temporarily replaced by the innocent thrill of an adventure. "Like spies?" "Exactly like spies," she said, tapping his nose. "But spies need to stay inside. Keep the curtains closed, and not make a peep. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am," he saluted playfully. Once inside, Elizabeth locked the deadbolt and engaged the chain. The room smelled of stale tobacco and industrial pine cleaner. But to her, it smelled like a temporary fortress. She turned on the small tube television, finding a channel playing vintage cartoons, and handed Samuel a stale granola bar from her bag. With her son distracted, the soldier went to work. She moved to the small, scratched wooden desk in the corner. From her go bag, she extracted a heavy, matte black Panasonic Toughbook. It was a military-grade laptop, completely air-gapped, meaning it had no wireless cards, no Bluetooth, no way to connect to the outside world unless she explicitly commanded it to. She booted it up. The screen glowed a harsh, clinical blue. Elizabeth reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the blood-stained thumb drive Elias Jackson had died to give her. She stared at it for a long moment. The Damascus ledger. Taking a deep breath, she plugged it into the USB port. A password prompt instantly flashed on the screen. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She knew Jackson. She knew how his mind worked. He wasn't a man who relied on complex algorithms for his personal kill switches. He relied on memory. He relied on the Brotherhood. She typed, "Fallen Angel _0404 April 4th. The date of the Damascus ambush. The date Echo 6 died." The prompt vanished, replaced by a progress bar that rapidly filled green. A single folder appeared on the desktop. Elizabeth opened it. The files were meticulously organized. Bank transfers, offshore account numbers, redacted CIA operational reports, and intercepted satellite communications. Jackson had spent the last 5 years hunting the truth. And he had found it. Elizabeth began to read, as her eyes scanned the documents. The air in the cheap motel room seemed to grow colder. The $2 million in gold bullion, the target of their raid in Damascus, hadn't been stolen by insurgents. It had been funneled into a numbered account in Zurich. The account belonged to a shell company owned by Arthur Sterling, the director of the intelligence support activity, the man who had given Echo 6 their orders. Sterling had used the Black Ops mission as a smokescreen to steal the gold to fund his own private off the book's intelligence network. And when the extraction team arrived, they weren't there to pull Echo 6 out. They were sent by Sterling to wipe them out, ensuring no one would ever know the truth. "You son of a bitch," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a rage so profound it shook her core. Sterling had sacrificed 2 of her men, her brothers, for money and power, and now, he was on the verge of being confirmed as the head of the CIA. He was burying the bodies before his coronation. She clicked on the final file. It was an audio recording. Jackson's voice filled the room, sounding strained and urgent, recorded just days before his death. "If you're listening to this, Lizzie, I'm already gone." The recording crackled. "Sterling knows Vance had the ledger. He knows I have the backup. He's unleashed a private contractor team. Ex-Spetsnaz. Mostly. They call themselves the Hounds. They are ruthless, Lizzie, but they have a weakness." Elizabeth leaned closer to the speakers. "The drive you're holding, it's not just data." Jackson's voice continued. "It's a Trojan horse. I embedded a dormant malware program into the root directory. If you plug it into any device connected to a network, it will instantly ping Sterling's private servers. But it will also backdoor his comms. It'll give you his entire playbook. But Lizzie, the moment you connect, they'll know your exact coordinates. You'll have a 5-minute head start before the Hounds descend on you." The recording clicked off. Elizabeth sat back, her mind racing. Jackson had given her the ultimate weapon against the director. But to use it, she had to paint a giant bullseye on her own back. She couldn't do it here. She couldn't do it with Samuel in the room. Suddenly, her trained peripheral vision caught a microscopic flash of light. It wasn't coming from the laptop screen. It was coming from the physical thumb drive itself. A tiny, nearly invisible red LED, blinking once every 10 seconds. Elizabeth's blood turned to ice. She yanked the drive out of the laptop. She flipped it over, inspecting the casing. There, hidden beneath a micro-thin layer of black plastic, was a secondary chip. Jackson hadn't put a tracker on the drive. Sterling's men had. When they shot Jackson, they didn't take the drive. They let him run with it. They wanted him to lead them to the rest of the surviving Echo 6 members. Jackson hadn't brought the files to save her. He had unwittingly brought a homing beacon straight to her kitchen. Elizabeth stood up so fast her chair crashed to the floor. Samuel jumped, dropping his granola bar. "Mommy? What's wrong?" "Sammy, get your coat. Now," Elizabeth ordered, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. It was the sharp, commanding bark of a squad leader. "But you said we were hiding." "The game has changed," she snapped, instantly regretting her tone when she saw the tears well up in his eyes. She dropped to one knee, grabbing his shoulders. "I'm sorry, baby, I'm sorry, but we have to go. Right this second." She grabbed the toughbook, shoving it and the thumb drive back into the go bag. She didn't bother packing the blankets or the snacks. She grabbed Samuel's hand and practically dragged him out the door. As she threw the bags into the trunk of the Volvo, a sound drifted through the damp Oregon air. It was faint at first, then growing steadily louder. The deep, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotor blades, cutting through the low clouds. They hadn't just tracked her to the motel. They were already here. Elizabeth slammed the trunk shut. The hunted had run as far as she could. Now, there was nowhere left to go but straight through the fire. "Get in the floorboard, Samuel," she said, pulling her heckler and coke from her holster and racking the slide. "And cover your ears." The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the helicopter blades wasn't just a sound. It was a physical vibration that rattled the fillings in Elizabeth's teeth and shook the rain off the motel's decaying roof. It was an unmarked MD 530F Little Bird. Painted a radar-absorbing matte black, hovering 50 feet above the parking lot like a mechanical bird of prey. Its blinding, million-candle power spotlight snapped on, slicing through the gray Oregon morning and turning the rain into streaks of silver fire. The beam swept across the tarmac, searching for movement. Elizabeth had just shoved Samuel into the floorboard of the Volvo when a massive, armored Chevrolet Suburban roared down the two-lane highway, smashing through the flimsy wooden gate of the Starlight Motor Inn. It fishtail-ed on the wet asphalt, aggressively blocking the only exit out of the parking lot. Her escape route was gone. The Volvo was useless. If she started the engine, the thermal cameras on the chopper would light the car up like a Christmas tree. And the heavy machine guns mounted on the Little Bird's skids would shred the vehicle in seconds. "Change of plans, Sammy," Elizabeth commanded, ripping the back door open and hauling her son out by his jacket collar. "We are not driving. We are running. To the trees. Right behind our room. Go." "Mommy. It's loud," Samuel cried out, his hands covering his ears, terrified by the deafening roar of the rotors and the blinding light. "I know, baby. But you have to move. Run to the big trees," she yelled over the engine noise, giving him a firm push toward the tree line just 20 yards behind room 14. She grabbed her go bag, throwing it over her shoulder, and gripped her heckler and coke tightly in her right hand. She positioned her body between Samuel and the parking lot, acting as a human shield as they sprinted toward the dense cover of the towering Douglas firs. Behind them, the doors of the Suburban flew open. 4 men poured out. They moved with terrifying, practiced efficiency, no shouting, no wasted movement. They were kitted out in urban assault gear, wielding suppressed Daniel Defense Mk-18 carbines. The Hounds, ex-Spetsnaz, Jackson had said, killers who had traded their flags for blank checks. "Target is mobile, Sector Alpha, moving toward the tree line," one of the operators barked into his comms, spotting the fleeting shadow of Elizabeth's jacket as she and Samuel breached the edge of the forest. Thwip 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 thwip. The suppressed gunfire sounded like industrial nail guns. Bark exploded from the trunk of a pine tree mere inches from Elizabeth's face, sending a shower of sharp wooden splinters into her cheek. A thin line of blood trickled down her jaw. She didn't flinch. She grabbed Samuel's arm, pulling him deeper into the damp, shadowy labyrinth of the forest. The ground was slick with mud and rotting pine needles, making every step treacherous. The canopy above was thick enough to break the helicopter's spotlight, casting the woods into a deep, disorienting twilight. "Down," Elizabeth hissed, dragging Samuel behind the massive, moss-covered roots of an overturned cedar tree. The crater left by the roots provided a natural trench. She pushed him down into the freezing mud. "Do not move, Samuel. Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear. Put your face in the dirt." Samuel was trembling violently, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the mud, but he did exactly as he was told. He curled into a tight ball, shutting his eyes. Elizabeth peeked over the edge of the root system. The thermal optics on the chopper were useless through the dense, wet canopy, meaning the Little Bird had to peel away to secure the perimeter from the air. That left the 4 hounds on the ground. They were fanning out, entering the woods in a tactical wedge formation, their weapons raised, moving silently across the pine needles. Elizabeth checked her magazine, 13 rounds of 9mm hollow points. Against 4 heavily armored contractors with rifles. A prolonged firefight was a mathematical impossibility. She had to use the environment. She had to hunt them one by one. She slipped away from Samuel's hiding spot, moving laterally through the brush. The ghost of Echo 6 was back in her element. She had fought in the jungles of Colombia and the mountains of the Hindu Kush. A damp Oregon forest was just another playground. She found a cluster of thick ferns flanked by 2 ancient oaks. She sank into the foliage, becoming perfectly still, regulating her breathing until it was a shallow, silent rhythm. 30 seconds later, the point man of the hounds stepped into her kill zone. He was scanning the ground, looking for broken twigs or footprints in the mud. He was good, but he was looking down. Elizabeth didn't shoot. The muzzle flash would give away her position to the other 3. Instead, as the operative stepped past her hiding spot, she lunged. Her left hand shot out, grabbing the hot suppressor of his rifle and wrenching it violently downward, pulling his center of gravity forward. Simultaneously, she drew the karambit blade from her belt, a curved, wicked piece of steel, and drove it precisely into the small, unarmored gap between his tactical helmet and the collar of his Kevlar vest. He didn't even have time to gasp. The blade severed the carotid artery and the vocal cords in one fluid motion. Elizabeth caught his falling body, easing him to the forest floor without a sound, and quietly relieved him of 2 spare rifle magazines and a stun grenade. 1 down, 3 to go. She wiped the blade on his uniform and moved like a shadow to her next position. "Yuri, sitrep," a voice crackled through the dead man's earpiece, which Elizabeth had slipped over her own ear. The Russian accent was thick, the tone strictly professional. "Yuri, respond." When silence answered, the tactical channel came alive. Contact lost with point. Switch to thermal overlays. She is close. Suppressive fire. Advance. The forest erupted. The remaining 3 operators unleashed a hail of blind, suppressed fire into the brush, shredding leaves, shattering branches, and turning the woods into a woodchipper. Elizabeth was forced to dive behind a thick boulder. Chips of stone rained down on her back as bullets hammered the other side. They were trying to flush her out. And worse, they were moving closer to the overturned cedar tree where Samuel was hiding. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. If they found the crater. Elizabeth pulled the pin on the stolen stun grenade. She cooked it for exactly 1.5 seconds. Then hurled it over the boulder, deep into the brush away from Samuel's position. Bang flash. The blinding explosion of light and thunder echoed through the trees, completely disorienting the hound's thermal optics and blowing out their electronic ear protection. Elizabeth broke cover. She raised her USP, acquiring the nearest target who was stumbling backward, clutching his ringing ears. Double tap, center mass. The rounds didn't penetrate his ceramic plates, but the kinetic impact hit him like a sledgehammer, knocking him flat on his back, gasping for air. Before the 3rd operative could pivot his rifle toward her, Elizabeth closed the distance, sliding across the slick mud. She kicked his knees sideways with a sickening snap. As he fell, she brought the heavy steel grip of her pistol crashing down across his jaw, instantly knocking him unconscious. The 4th man, the squad leader, emerged from the smoke of the stun grenade. He saw his team decimated by a single ghost in a soccer mom's jacket. He didn't hesitate. He raised his Mk-18 and fired. Elizabeth threw herself to the side. But she wasn't quite fast enough. A 5.56 round grazed her left bicep, tearing through the fabric of her jacket and searing her flesh like a hot iron. She hit the mud hard, rolling behind the cover of a massive tree trunk. She bit down on her lips so hard she tasted copper, refusing to make a sound. Her left arm went numb, blood quickly soaking her sleeve. "I have her pinned," the squad leader yelled into his comms. "Bring the bird back. Raise the sector." Above the tree line, the horrific roar of the little bird returned. It was circling back, and this time, it was going to light up the entire forest block. Elizabeth looked at her right hand. Her gun was jammed in the mud from the fall. She had seconds before the chopper shredded the trees to sawdust. She looked past the squad leader. Through the rain and the trees, she could see the parking lot. The armored Suburban they had arrived in was still there, and its engine was still running. It was a suicidal play, but it was the only one she had left. "Hey!" Elizabeth screamed, intentionally breaking her cover and stepping out from behind the tree. The squad leader spun around, his rifle rising. But Elizabeth wasn't aiming at him. She had picked up the dropped Mk-18 from the operative she had knocked out. She aimed high, toward the canopy, and squeezed the trigger. She fired a sustained, fully automatic burst directly at a massive, dead branch of a towering oak tree hanging directly above the squad leader. The 5.56 rounds sawed through the rotting wood. With a deafening crack, a branch the size of a telephone pole plummeted, crashing down directly on top of the squad leader, pinning him to the forest floor under 2 tons of wet timber. The air was instantly filled with the deafening roar of the helicopter's miniguns tearing through the upper canopy. Searching for her, Elizabeth dropped the rifle. She ignored the burning pain in her arm and sprinted back to the crater. Samuel was still there, curled tight, shaking violently. "Sammy, up, up," she yelled, hauling him out of the mud with her good arm. "Mommy, you're bleeding," he cried, seeing the red stain on her jacket. "It's just ketchup from the game. Baby, I'm fine. We have to run, right now." She threw him over her right shoulder and ran with a desperate, reckless speed toward the parking lot. The helicopter's spotlight caught them just as they broke the tree line, bathing them in blinding white light. A line of heavy-caliber rounds chewed up the asphalt inches from her boots. Elizabeth dove behind the armored Suburban. She wrenched the driver's side door open, tossing Samuel into the passenger seat. She jumped in, slamming the heavy, bulletproof door shut just as another volley of rounds pinged harmlessly against the reinforced steel. She threw the massive vehicle into drive, stomped the accelerator to the floor, and the Suburban launched forward. It smashed through the remnants of the Starlight Motor Inn sign, tires smoking on the wet asphalt, and rocketed onto the highway, leaving the chopper and the ghosts of the hounds in its wake. Elizabeth looked at Samuel. He was staring at her, his eyes wide, traumatized, stripped of all childhood innocence. She gripped the steering wheel, tears finally mixing with the blood and rain on her face. The game was over. They were at war. The armored Chevrolet Suburban tore down the winding, rain-slicked asphalt of Highway 26 like a battering ram. Inside the cabin, the heavy V8 engine roared, a deep, mechanical growl that vibrated through the floorboards. But to Elizabeth, The loudest sound in the world was the ragged, panicked breathing of the little boy curled in the passenger seat. She checked the rearview mirror. No headlights. She rolled down the window an inch, fighting the howling wind to listen for the rhythmic thumping of the little bird helicopter. Nothing but the storm. They had lost the eye in the sky, for now. But the victory was hollow, paid for in blood. Elizabeth's left arm throbbed with a sickening, radiating heat. The 5.56 caliber bullet hadn't hit the bone, but it had carved a deep, jagged trench through her bicep. Her black tactical jacket was saturated, the dark, sticky lifeblood seeping through the fabric and pooling on the leather console. Her fingers were going numb. If she didn't stop the bleeding soon, she was going to pass out behind the wheel at 80 miles an hour. She needed to get off the main road. The Suburban was a stolen contractor vehicle. It was undoubtedly equipped with a military-grade GPS transponder. The hounds wouldn't need a helicopter to find them, they just needed a laptop. A mile ahead, a rusted, overgrown sign pointed toward an abandoned logging road. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She yanked the heavy steering wheel to the right, sending the massive SUV skidding onto a treacherous dirt path flanked by towering, ancient redwoods. The trees swallowed them whole, their massive branches interlocking to form a natural roof that completely blocked out the gray sky. She drove 3 miles deep into the forest until the road dead-ended at a dilapidated, rotting logging mill. It was a graveyard of rusted machinery and decaying wood. Forgotten by time. Perfect. She slammed the SUV into park and killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the aggressive drumming of the rain on the reinforced steel roof. Elizabeth closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, gathering every ounce of strength she had left. Then, she turned to her son. Samuel was pressed as far back into the leather seat as he could go. His knees were pulled to his chest, his eyes wide, glassy, and fixed on the pool of blood on the center console. He looked so incredibly small. The innocence that had defined him just 24 hours ago had been violently stripped away, leaving behind a terrified child who had just watched his mother kill men in the woods. "Sammy," Elizabeth said softly. Her voice was weak, but she forced it to be steady. He flinched. He actually flinched at the sound of her voice. That micro-expression broke Elizabeth's heart more thoroughly than any bullet ever could. The steel box in her mind, the one where she kept the soldier, cracked open, letting the devastating guilt of a mother pour out. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so sorry you had to see that." Samuel didn't speak. A single tear tracked through the mud and grime on his pale cheek. "I need your help, buddy," Elizabeth said, unbuckling her seatbelt with her good hand. She reached into the back seat, grabbing her go bag, and then popped the heavy center console of the Suburban. Just as she suspected, the contractors were well equipped. Inside the console was a black, trauma-grade individual first aid kit, IFAK. She pulled it out and unzipped it, revealing Israeli bandages, quick-clot combat gauze, and a tourniquet. "Sammy, look at me," she commanded gently. Slowly, his eyes dragged up from the blood to her face. "The game is over," she said, holding his gaze. It was the hardest thing she had ever had to do, to purposefully crush a child's illusion. "There are no spies. This isn't a vacation. There are very bad men trying to hurt us. But I need you to know something. I need you to listen to me closer than you have ever listened to anyone in your entire life." She leaned closer, ignoring the searing pain in her arm. "Before I was your mommy, I was a soldier. A very good one. My job was to stop monsters from hurting good people. I thought I left those monsters behind when you were born. But they found us. And I promise you, on my life, I will not let them touch you. But I can't do it alone right now. I am hurt. Samuel, I need my brave boy to help me. Can you do that?" For a long, agonizing moment, the boy just stared at her. The silence stretched. Elizabeth held her breath, praying she hadn't pushed him into complete psychological shock. Then, slowly, Samuel uncurled his legs. He sat up straighter. The trembling in his hands subsided just a fraction. He wiped the tear from his cheek with the back of his dirty sleeve. What do you need me to do?" His voice was a tiny, fragile whisper. Elizabeth exhaled a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Thank God. I need you to open this," she said, sliding a sealed packet of QuikClot gauze across the console. While Samuel struggled with the thick plastic packaging, Elizabeth gritted her teeth and used a pair of trauma shears from the kit to cut away the left sleeve of her jacket and shirt. The wound was ugly, deep, jagged, and bleeding freely. "Okay, I got it," Samuel said, holding up the white, chemically treated gauze. His eyes widened when he saw the raw wound. But he didn't look away. "Good man," Elizabeth breathed, sweat beading on her forehead. "Now, I'm going to pack this into my arm. It's going to hurt me a lot. I might make a loud noise. Don't be scared, okay? It's just noise." He nodded, biting his lower lip. Elizabeth took the gauze. She didn't hesitate. Survival was a math equation. And pain was just a variable. She jammed the chemically treated fabric directly into the bullet channel, pressing hard to initiate the clotting agent. A sharp, involuntary gasp ripped from her throat. Her vision tunneled, the edges going dark, but she clamped her jaw shut, refusing to scream in front of her son. She maintained brutal pressure for 3 agonizing minutes. "Okay," she panted, her face deathly pale. "Now the bandage." With Samuel's clumsy but determined help, she managed to wrap the tight, elastic Israeli bandage around her bicep, securing the dressing and finally stopping the hemorrhage. She leaned back against the headrest, her chest heaving, her left arm completely immobile. She was exhausted, battered, and running on fumes, but she was alive. Samuel was looking at her hands. Her knuckles were bruised, her fingernails caked with dirt and blood. "Are you a superhero?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a mix of awe and lingering fear. Elizabeth let out a weak, humorless laugh. "No, baby. Superheroes don't make mistakes. I made a big one. I trusted the wrong people a long time ago." She reached out with her right hand and gently brushed the wet hair away from his forehead. "There's a story," she said softly, "about sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. Most people are sheep. They are kind, gentle, and they just want to eat grass and live in peace. But there are wolves in the dark. And wolves eat sheep." Samuel listened intently, his breathing finally returning to normal. But then, Elizabeth continued, her eyes hardening. "There are sheepdogs. They look a little bit like the wolves. They have sharp teeth, and they can be very dangerous. But they love the flock. And they will fight the wolves to the death to protect the sheep." She squeezed his hand. "I am a sheepdog, Sammy, and you are my whole flock." Samuel looked down at his mother's blood-stained jacket, and then back up at her tired, fierce eyes. He nodded slowly. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was replaced by a small, fragile seed of understanding. Okay, Elizabeth sighed, forcing herself to sit up straight. The emotional triage was done, it was time for tactical triage. We can't stay in this car. The bad guys can track it. We need to leave it here and find a new ride. She reached under the steering column, searching for the vehicle's diagnostic port. She found the hardwired GPS tracker plugged into the wiring harness and violently ripped it out, crushing the small black plastic box under her boot. "Grab your coat, buddy. We have a long walk ahead of us," she said, grabbing her go bag and the stolen Mk18 carbine. They stepped out of the heavy armored vehicle and back into the freezing Oregon rain. They were miles from civilization, hunted by ghosts, and bleeding, but as Elizabeth took her son's hand and began walking down the muddy logging road toward the highway, she felt a dangerous shift in her own mind. She was done running blindly. It was time to find a secure phone line. It was time to call an old friend. And then, it was time to hunt the director. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick, freezing fog that clung to the Oregon highway like wet wool. Elizabeth and Samuel had been walking for 3 hours. Every step was a calculated negotiation with pain. Her left arm felt as though it was packed with crushed glass. The quick clot and tight bandage holding the blood in, but doing nothing to stop the agonizing throb of torn muscle. Samuel trudged beside her, his small hand wrapped tightly in her right. He hadn't complained once. The boy who, just yesterday, had whined about eating his broccoli was now marching down a desolate logging road with the stoic endurance of a seasoned soldier. It broke Elizabeth's heart, but it also kept them alive. "Almost there, buddy," she rasped, her breath pluming in the cold air. Through the gray mist, the hazy, flickering neon lights of a forgotten truck stop bled into view. It was a miserable concrete island consisting of a gas station, a rusted diner, and a row of empty diesel pumps. But to Elizabeth, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Keep your head down, Sammy. Hood up," she instructed, pulling the oversized hood of his jacket over his wet hair. She zipped her own torn, blood-stained jacket up to her chin, concealing the makeshift bandage and tucking her right hand, and the stolen Mk18 carbine, tightly against her side under the fabric. They bypassed the diner and walked straight into the convenience store. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, synthetic pine, and old hot dogs. A teenager with acne and heavy eyelids barely looked up from his smartphone as they walked down the aisles. Elizabeth moved quickly. She grabbed 2 bottles of water, a package of beef jerky, a generic first aid kit, and, most importantly, a cheap prepaid burner phone hanging on a cardboard rack near the register. She paid with a crumpled $100 bill from her pocket, ignoring the kid's suspicious glance at her mud-caked boots and pale, sweat-sheened face. "Keep the change," she muttered, grabbing the plastic bag and ushering Samuel back out into the freezing fog. They huddled behind a pair of rusted ice machines at the side of the building. Out of sight from the road, Elizabeth ripped the packaging off the phone, her fingers clumsy and numb. She dialed a string of 14 numbers, a sequence routed through 3 different dummy corporations in Eastern Europe before connecting to a satellite relay. It was a number she had committed to memory 8 years ago, praying she would never have to use it. It rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, a voice answered. It was deep, gravelly, and carried the weight of a man who had smoked 2 packs a day since the Carter administration. "The shop is closed," the voice rumbled. "I need a mechanic." Elizabeth replied, her voice steady despite the shivering of her body. My engine is running hot. Code. Blackwood. A long, heavy silence stretched over the line. Blackwood is a dead account, the man finally said, the timbre of his voice shifting. Growing dangerously sharp. Has been for 5 years. Who the hell is this? It's Lizzie. Silas. I'm cashing in my marker. Another silence. This one thick with shock. Silas Thorne was a legend in the Black Ops community. He wasn't a trigger puller, he was a quartermaster. A fixer. And a ghost maker. He lived entirely off the grid. Supplying untraceable weapons, identities, and safe havens to operatives who had nowhere else to go. 5 years ago, in a botched extraction in Bogotá, Elizabeth had carried Silas 3 miles through a jungle with a bullet in his lung. He owed her his life. Jesus Christ. Lizzie. Silas breathed. They said you were in the ground with the rest of Echo 6. I'm above ground, Silas. But I'm bleeding. And I have cargo. Precious cargo. She looked down at Samuel, who was quietly chewing on a piece of beef jerky. I'm at a truck stop off Highway 26. Near the Tillamook Forest turnoff. I need extraction. Give me 20 minutes. Stay out of the light. The line went dead. Exactly 18 minutes later, a battered, rust-eaten Ford F-250 pulled into the back lot of the gas station. The headlights blinked twice. Elizabeth grabbed Samuel and the bag, stepping out from the shadows. The passenger door swung open. Behind the wheel sat a mountain of a man with a thick, graying beard, wearing a faded flannel shirt and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked like a local logger. But the customized, suppressed Glock 19 resting on the dashboard told a different story. Silas took one look at Elizabeth's pale face, the blood-soaked sleeve of her jacket, and the terrified little boy clinging to her leg. His jaw tightened. Get in, he grunted. The heat inside the truck was blasting. Samuel immediately curled up on the center console, the warmth finally lulling his exhausted body to sleep. Elizabeth sank into the passenger seat, the remaining adrenaline completely evaporating, leaving her weak and dizzy. Silas put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, driving with the smooth, calculated precision of a wheelman. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask about the blood, the boy, or the ghost she was running from. That wasn't the way their world worked. They drove for an hour, turning off the highway onto a series of increasingly rugged dirt roads, winding deep into the coastal mountains. Finally, they arrived at a heavy steel gate hidden beneath a canopy of ancient pines. Silas punched a code into a keypad, and the gate swung silently open, revealing a sprawling, fortress-like cabin built into the side of a rocky hill. Welcome to the sanctuary, Silas muttered, killing the engine. He helped Elizabeth carry Samuel inside, laying the boy on a massive leather sofa near a roaring stone fireplace. Then, he turned to Elizabeth. Jacket off. Let's see the damage, he ordered, pulling a stainless steel medical tray from a cabinet. Elizabeth gritted her teeth and let him cut the rest of her sleeve away. Peeling the blood-caked Israeli bandage off her arm, Silas inspected the wound, his expression grim. Through and through, missed the bone, but it tore up the muscle. He evaluated, cleaning his hands with surgical scrub. I have to stitch the inner layers. Lizzie, it's gonna sting. I don't have anesthesia, just a bottle of Kentucky bourbon. Pour me a glass, and thread the needle. Silas, she said, staring blankly at the fire. For the next 45 minutes, The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire and Elizabeth's ragged breathing. She gripped the wooden armrest of her chair until her knuckles turned white. Silently absorbing the agonizing pain as Silas meticulously repaired the damage, stitch by stitch. When he finally finished, wrapping her arm in fresh, clean bandages, he handed her the glass of bourbon. She downed it in one fiery gulp. "So," Silas said, pulling up a chair opposite her and lighting a thick cigar. "Who shot you, Lizzie?" Elizabeth looked at the sleeping form of her son. The maternal instinct to protect him was still fiercely burning, but it was now fused with cold, calculated vengeance. "Arthur Sterling," she said. Silas froze, the cigar stopping halfway to his mouth. "The director? The man who's about to be confirmed as the director of Central Intelligence on national television in 2 days? He set up the Damascus ambush. Silas. He stole the gold to fund his own black network. Elias Jackson found the proof. Sterling had him killed. And now he's hunting the rest of us. He sent a contractor team, the Hounds, after me and my boy." Silas let out a long, slow whistle, blowing a cloud of blue smoke toward the wooden ceiling. "You kicked a hornet's nest. Lizzie, Sterling is practically untouchable right now. He's got half of Capitol Hill in his pocket and a private army at his back." "I have his ledger," Elizabeth said, reaching into her pocket with her good hand and tossing the bloody thumb drive onto the table. "Jackson embedded a backdoor program in it. If we plug it into a network device, it gives us Sterling's entire playbook. It also broadcasts our location to his kill teams. But I don't care anymore." She leaned forward, the firelight reflecting in her cold, dead eyes. "I'm not running anymore, Silas. I tried to be a mother. I tried to let the past die. But he brought the war to my front door. He put a gun in my son's face." She stood up, ignoring the throbbing pain in her arm, and looked down at the old quartermaster. "I need weapons, Silas. I need explosives. I need you to build me a digital ghost so I can breach that drive without them dropping a missile on this cabin. I am going to tear Arthur Sterling's empire down to the studs. And then I am going to put a bullet between his eyes." Silas looked at the fierce, unbroken woman standing before him. He saw the ghost of Echo 6, resurrected and unchained. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "All right, Lizzie," he said, crushing his cigar out in an ashtray. "Let's go shopping." Silas Thorne's secret bunker was buried 50 feet underground, reinforced with concrete walls thick enough to withstand a localized airstrike. The air down here was dense, heavy with the metallic tang of gun oil, spent brass, and the distinct ozone smell radiating from the humming server racks in the corner. Silas sat before a bank of 6 monitors, his massive, calloused fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that defied his imposing, lumbering frame. Elizabeth stood directly behind him. She had traded her blood-soaked tactical jacket for a dark, oversized wool turtleneck borrowed from Silas. Her left arm was bound tightly in a makeshift sling against her chest. The torn muscle throbbed with a vicious, biting agony, but her eyes were completely dead to the pain. They were cold, sharp, and focused like a razor's edge. "This drive is a ticking time bomb, Lizzie," Silas rumbled, plugging Elias Jackson's blood-stained USB into a completely isolated terminal. Jackson hard-coded a Trojan horse into the root directory. The second this drive touches a live network, it's going to kick down the front door to Arthur Sterling's private servers. But the trade-off is brutal. It's going to broadcast a massive homing beacon, screaming our exact coordinates to every hound on Sterling's payroll. Can you block the signal? Elizabeth asked, her voice a flat, emotionless drone. Silas smirked, revealing teeth stained yellow by decades of cheap cigars. I'm not going to block it. I'm going to scramble it. I'm routing this ping through a dozen proxy servers, bouncing it from an internet cafe in Jakarta to an abandoned weather station in Siberia. By the time Sterling's attack dogs trace the origin, we'll have already ended this. He hit the enter key. The bank of monitors flickered wildly. Cascades of green code rained down the black screens in a digital torrential downpour. And then, a single, decrypted folder appeared. Silas clicked it open. The darkest, most heavily guarded secrets of the United States intelligence community spilled out before them. Numbered Swiss bank accounts, multi-million-dollar wire transfers, and heavily redacted operational reports. Good God, Silas whispered, his eyes narrowing as he scanned a ledger. Jackson wasn't lying. Sterling orchestrated the entire Damascus ambush. He used private military contractors to wipe out Echo 6, stealing the $2 million in gold bullion to bankroll a shadow intelligence network completely off the government's books. He's building his own private empire. And tomorrow, he's scheduled to be confirmed by the Senate as the new director of the CIA. Elizabeth gritted her teeth, the knuckles of her right hand turning white. He'll have absolute, unchecked power to erase anyone who gets in his way. We have to cut the head off the snake before it grows new fangs. What's his schedule? Silas clacked a few keys, bypassing layers of encryption to pull up Sterling's personal itinerary. Here we go. Tomorrow night, right before the Senate hearings, Sterling is hosting a highly exclusive, black-tie charity gala at the Emerald Tower in downtown Seattle. Top floor. The guest list is a who's who of heavyweight politicians, billionaires, and power brokers. Elizabeth stared at the blueprints of the Emerald Tower now displayed on the monitor. It was a soaring fortress of glass and steel. Security is going to be an absolute nightmare, Silas warned, crossing his massive arms over his chest. Retina scanners, millimeter wave detectors, and a personal detail of X-Tier 1 operators. Not to mention, if you discharge a weapon up there, you'll be dealing with dozens of security cameras and the Seattle PD in a matter of minutes. It's a suicide run, Lizzie. I'm not planning on using the front door, Elizabeth stated, her eyes tracing the ventilation shafts and elevator shafts on the schematic. I'm going to be a ghost. I need gear, Silas. Silas let out a long, heavy sigh, knowing damn well there was no stopping a mother fighting for her cub. He stood up, leading her deeper into the bunker, stopping before a massive, bank vault steel door. He spun the combination dial and hauled it open. An expansive armory was revealed. Dozens of assault rifles, submachine guns, sniper systems, and high explosives were meticulously arranged on pegboards. Make yourself at home, Silas grunted. Elizabeth walked along the wall. The cold, familiar touch of gunmetal beneath her fingertips awakened every dormant combat instinct she possessed. She bypassed the heavy, cumbersome weapons, reaching for a compact, ultra-lightweight SIG MCX Rattler short-barreled rifle, already fitted with a suppressor. It was the perfect tool for close-quarters battle in a confined environment. She loaded 6 magazines of armor-piercing .300 blackout rounds, stuffing them into a minimalist tactical chest rig. She added a Sig Sauer P365 micro-compact pistol to an ankle holster, clipped 2 folding tactical knives to her belt, and grabbed 3 blocks of C4 plastic explosive wired with remote detonators. Everything was light, lethal, and utterly silent. When Elizabeth finished gearing up in a pitch-black, form-fitting, non-reflective infiltration suit, the suburban single mother was entirely gone. The sheepdog had returned, a fierce, relentless predator ready to tear the wolves apart. They headed back upstairs to the main cabin. Samuel was finally awake. He was curled up on the oversized leather sofa, both hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate Silas had made him. His wide eyes tracked his mother, filled with a heartbreaking mix of shock and pure awe. Elizabeth walked over and knelt down to his eye level. Despite the lethal arsenal strapped to her body, her gaze remained profoundly soft when she looked at her son. "Where are you going, Mommy?" Samuel asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I had to go clean up some garbage, sweetie." Elizabeth smiled, reaching out to brush his messy hair. "But I need you to do a top-secret mission for me. It's very important." Silas stepped forward, handing a small, encrypted 2-way radio to the boy. "Kiddo, from now on, you are our Overwatch," Silas said, his gruff voice surprisingly warm. "You're going to stay here with me. We'll watch the cameras and guide your mom through the headset. Think you can handle that?" A spark of bravery lit up Samuel's eyes. He nodded emphatically, gripping the radio with both hands. "I can do it." Elizabeth pressed a gentle kiss to her son's forehead, absorbing his warmth and that familiar, sweet scent. He was her anchor, the final tether keeping her tied to her humanity. She stood up, locking eyes with Silas. "Keep him safe, no matter what happens to me. You promise me you'll wipe him off the map?" Silas nodded slowly, his expression set in stone. "You have my word. Now go hunt, Lizzie." Elizabeth turned and walked out the cabin door, disappearing into the pitch-black silence of the Oregon woods. The rainstorm had passed, but a much more violent, bloody storm was about to crash down on Arthur Sterling in Seattle. Seattle from above was a sprawling grid of neon and wet asphalt. But the Emerald Tower stood apart. It was an 80-story monolith of black glass and brushed steel, a monument to wealth and untouchable power. Tonight, its penthouse was a glowing crown, hosting the most exclusive gala in the Pacific Northwest. Inside, Arthur Sterling was drinking champagne and shaking hands, mere hours away from becoming the most powerful intelligence director in the world. Outside, clinging to a maintenance ladder in the freezing, grease-slicked darkness of the primary elevator shaft, Elizabeth Turner was preparing to tear his crown down. The wind howled through the concrete abyss, threatening to peel her off the metal rungs. Below her was a 500-foot drop into absolute nothingness. Above her was the belly of the beast. "Radio check. Lizzie, you copy?" Silas's gravelly voice crackled in her custom earpiece, instantly cutting through the sound of the wind. "Solid copy, Silas," Elizabeth whispered, her breath misting in the cold air. She reached up with her right hand, pulling her body weight up another rung. Her left arm, tightly bound against her chest under her infiltration suit, screamed in protest. The stitches were holding, but the torn muscle burned like battery acid with every movement. "I've tapped into the tower's secondary mainframe," Silas continued, the rapid clacking of his keyboard audible in the background. "Sterling didn't just hire a private security firm, he brought in his own Praetorian Guard. I'm tracking 12 hostiles on the penthouse level. Thermal signatures indicate heavy body armor and concealed automatics. They are sweeping the perimeter every 4 minutes. Understood. I'm 3 floors down from the maintenance access hatch. Elizabeth gritted her teeth, pausing to let a wave of nausea pass. Suddenly, a smaller, much softer voice cut into the encrypted channel. "Mommy, are you there?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cold steel of the ladder. A genuine, aching smile broke through her mask of concentration. "I'm right here. Overwatch. How's my favorite guy doing?" "I'm looking at the blueprint," Samuel said, his voice laced with the serious concentration of a 7-year-old given a vital task. "Uncle Silas showed me the green dots. You are a blue dot. You're climbing very high." "I am, buddy. But I'm not scared, because I know you're watching my back." "I am. The green dots are walking in circles. You have to be super quiet. Like a ninja." "Ninja mode engaged," she promised softly. "Silas, I'm at the hatch. Level 79. Give me a green light on the exhaust fans." "Stand by," Silas muttered, disabling fan array 3, now. You have a 90-second window before the ambient temperature triggers a system reboot and the blades kick back on. "Move, Lizzie." Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She abandoned the ladder, wedging her boots against the concrete walls of the shaft, and unlatched the heavy steel grate of the ventilation duct. She hauled herself inside just as the massive, industrial fan blades 10 feet below her ground to a halt. The duct was cramped, smelling of filtered air and dust. She crawled forward on her elbows and knees, relying entirely on her right arm to drag her body weight, protecting the gunshot wound on her left. 70 seconds. She navigated the labyrinth of aluminum ductwork, guided by the heads-up display on her tactical contact lens, which Silas was feeding with real-time telemetry. 40 seconds. Take the next right, Lizzie. The vent directly above the catering corridor is dead ahead, Silas instructed. She scrambled forward, her breathing heavy and ragged in the confined space. She reached the grate. Below her, through the metal slats, she could see a pristine, white-tiled hallway. Waiters in tuxedos were rushing past, carrying silver trays of caviar and crystal flutes of champagne. 10 seconds until fan reboot, Silas warned. Elizabeth drew her customized karambit knife. She carefully unscrewed the 4 bolts holding the grate in place, catching them before they could fall and clatter on the tiles below. 3, 2. She lifted the grate, slid it silently into the duct beside her, and dropped through the opening. She landed in a perfect, silent crouch on top of a massive stainless steel commercial refrigerator, entirely hidden in the shadows near the ceiling. A fraction of a second later, a deep, vibrating hum echoed through the walls as the industrial fans roared back to life in the shaft she had just vacated. She exhaled a long, slow breath. Phase 1 was complete. Below her, the frantic pace of the catering staff continued. But Elizabeth's eyes weren't on the waiters. She was watching the end of the corridor, where a man in a sharply tailored black suit was standing perfectly still. He had an earpiece, a subtle bulge under his left armpit, and the distinct, hyper-vigilant posture of a Tier 1 operator. "Hostile approaching your sector," Silas murmured. "I see him," Elizabeth whispered. The guard began a slow patrol down the corridor, moving away from the main kitchen and directly beneath Elizabeth's perch. He wasn't looking up. Nobody ever looks up. As he passed directly under the refrigerator, Elizabeth dropped. She didn't use a weapon. She used gravity and physics. She landed squarely on his shoulders, her right arm wrapping instantly around his throat in a blood choke, her legs locking around his torso like a vice. Before the man could even raise his hands to fight back, the precise pressure on his carotid arteries cut off the blood flow to his brain. He was unconscious in less than 4 seconds. Elizabeth eased his heavy, limp body to the tiled floor without making a single sound. She dragged him into a nearby utility closet, locking the door behind her. She quickly stripped him of his encrypted radio and a spare magazine for her P365. She stood up, adjusting her tactical rig, and stepped out of the closet. She moved past the kitchen, slipping through a set of heavy mahogany double doors, and finally stepped into the shadows of the mezzanine overlooking the main ballroom. The sight below was breathtaking. A massive crystal chandelier bathed the room in golden light. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Women in designer gowns and men in bespoke tuxedos mingled, completely oblivious to the predator standing in the darkness above them. And there he was, Arthur Sterling. He was standing near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the Seattle skyline, holding a glass of scotch. He was older than Elizabeth remembered, his hair silver at the temples, but his eyes still held that same cold, calculating arrogance. The man who had sold her team to the slaughter. The man who had sent killers to murder her son. He was smiling, shaking the hand of a U.S. senator. Elizabeth felt a cold, terrifying calm wash over her. The pain in her arm vanished, entirely eclipsed by the singular, burning focus of her mission. She reached over her shoulder and unslung the SIG MCX rattler. She checked the chamber with a soft, metallic snick. "I have a visual on the target," Elizabeth whispered into the comms. "I see him on the cameras," Silas replied, his voice tense. "There are 4 guards in his immediate vicinity. If you take the shot from there, the glass will shatter, the panic will be absolute, and you'll have an army on you in 30 seconds. I'm not going to shoot him from the shadows." "Silas," Elizabeth said, her eyes locked on Sterling's face. "I want him to know exactly who is pulling the trigger. I want him to look at the ghost he created." "Mommy?" Samuel's voice chimed in, small and worried. "Are you going to be okay?" Elizabeth's finger rested gently against the trigger guard. She took a deep breath, letting the scent of expensive perfume and impending violence fill her lungs. "I'm going to be just fine. Overwatch. Mommy's about to finish the game." Elizabeth stepped out of the shadows, walking slowly and deliberately down the grand staircase toward the glittering crowd. A fully armed sheepdog descending into the den of the wolves. The transition from the shadows to the light was absolute. Elizabeth Turner stepped off the carpeted landing and began her descent down the grand, sweeping staircase of the Emerald Tower's penthouse. For the first 3 seconds, no one noticed the ghost in their midst. The string quartet was playing a vibrant Vivaldi piece. The champagne was flowing, and the dull roar of the elite-class networking masked the sound of her tactical boots on the marble steps. Then, a woman draped in diamonds at the base of the stairs turned around. The crystal flute slipped from her manicured fingers, shattering on the floor. Her gasp was sharp, piercing the ambient noise like a siren. The music faltered, a cellist missing a note as his eyes locked onto the stairs. Silence, heavy and suffocating, rippled through the ballroom. Elizabeth descended with the terrifying, unhurried grace of an apex predator. The matte black infiltration suit, the tactical rig strapped with magazines, and the suppressed SIG MCX rattler resting perfectly against her shoulder stood in jarring, violent contrast to the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. She looked like the Grim Reaper crashing a wedding. Hostels moving. Lizzie. 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. Silas's voice crackled urgently in her ear. 2 men in tailored suits, Sterling's Praetorian Guard, broke from the crowd, their hands reaching inside their jackets for their concealed weapons. Elizabeth didn't break her stride. She didn't shout a warning. She simply pivoted her hips. Peefed. 2 suppressed subsonic rounds left the barrel of the rattler. They were precision strikes, specifically targeting the pelvis of the guard on her right, instantly shattering the bone and dropping him to the floor in a heap of agony. She snapped the muzzle to her left. The second guard had his weapon out. Elizabeth fired 3 times, 1 round to his weapon hand, disarming him violently, and 2 to his heavy ceramic chest plate. The kinetic impact knocked the breath from his lungs and sent him crashing into a pyramid of champagne glasses. The ballroom erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. Politicians dove behind catering tables. Billionaires scrambled toward the exits, screaming. Elizabeth fired a single burst into the vaulted ceiling. Plaster rained down. Nobody moves. Her voice roared, amplified by the acoustics of the grand hall. It was the command voice of an alpha, honed on the battlefields of the Middle East. It froze the panic instantly. The crowd cowered, utterly terrified of the woman holding their lives in her hands. Elizabeth's eyes cut through the terrified crowd, locking onto her target. Arthur Sterling hadn't run. He stood frozen by the floor-to-ceiling window, his face drained of all color. His glass of scotch still gripped tightly in his hand. 2 of his remaining personal guards stepped in front of him, weapons drawn, creating a human shield. Elizabeth walked toward them, her rifle raised, the pain in her left arm entirely forgotten. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. "Drop the weapons, or I'll put a bullet through both your optic nerves before you can blink," Elizabeth stated, her voice devoid of any bluff. The 2 guards, hardened contractors who recognized a Tier 1 operator when they saw one, looked at her stance, her customized gear, and the dead emptiness in her eyes. Slowly, they lowered their guns and kicked them across the marble floor. Elizabeth stepped up to Arthur Sterling. They were separated by a mere 5 feet. "Elizabeth Turner," Sterling breathed, his voice a mixture of absolute shock and rising panic. "You're supposed to be dead." "I was dead, Arthur," Elizabeth replied, her voice dangerously soft. "I died in Damascus with Miller and Reyes. But you made the fatal mistake of waking me up." Sterling swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure. He glanced around at the cowering senators and journalists. "You're insane. You're a rogue operative crashing a charity event. The police are already on their way. You have no way out of this building." "Turner, I didn't come here to escape. I came here to deliver a message," Elizabeth said. "You sent the hounds to my home. You put a gun in my son's face. Arthur, you brought a war to a mother's doorstep." Sterling scoffed, though sweat was beading on his forehead. "You have nothing. You're a relic, a broken soldier making baseless accusations. No one here will believe a word you say." "They won't have to take my word for it," Elizabeth said. She tapped the comms unit in her ear. "Silas, burn his house down." "With pleasure," Silas growled over the radio. High above the ballroom, the massive digital screens that had been displaying the charity's logo flickered and died. A second later, they blazed back to life. But it wasn't a logo anymore. It was the Damascus Ledger. Silas had hacked the entire audiovisual system of the Emerald Tower. Across the massive screens, undeniable proof began to scroll. Bank transfers from a CIA's slush fund to offshore accounts in Zurich. Unredacted orders bearing Sterling's personal digital signature. Authorizing the strike on Echo 6. Emails detailing the assassination of journalist Marcus Vance. Gasps echoed through the room. This time not from fear of Elizabeth's gun, but from the magnitude of the treason being displayed in 40-foot high definition. Senators who had been shaking Sterling's hand minutes ago now looked at him with sheer horror. Journalists were pulling out their phones, recording the screens, broadcasting the fall of Arthur Sterling to the world in real time. Sterling turned around, watching his empire crumble pixel by pixel. His face contorted from shock into absolute, unhinged rage. "You bitch," he snarled, turning back to Elizabeth. "You think this stops me? I am the system." His hand shot into his tuxedo pocket, pulling out a gold-plated, subcompact .380 pistol he had kept hidden. He raised it, aiming squarely at Elizabeth's chest. He never got to pull the trigger. Elizabeth's reflexes were forged in the fires of 100 Black Ops missions. Her right hand blurred. She didn't use the rifle. She drew the P365 from her ankle holster in a fraction of a second. Bang! The sound of the unsuppressed gunshot was deafening. Sterling staggered backward, dropping his gold-plated gun. He looked down at his chest, his hands trembling as they touched the rapidly spreading crimson stain blooming on his white tuxedo shirt. His knees buckled, and the man who would be king collapsed onto the polished marble floor. Elizabeth stood over him. She hadn't shot him in the heart. She had shot him in the right lung. A fatal wound if left untreated, but slow enough for him to watch his legacy burn. "The system is broken, Arthur," Elizabeth whispered down to him, holstering her pistol. "And Echo 6 is finally at peace." Sirens began to wail in the distance. A rising chorus of police cruisers converging on the Emerald Tower. Elizabeth turned her back on the bleeding director and the stunned crowd. She tapped her earpiece. "Overwatch. This is Ghost Actual," she said, her voice softening for the first time since she entered the building. "I hear you, Mommy," Samuel's voice came through, a beacon of pure light in the darkness. "Mission accomplished, baby." Elizabeth smiled, a single tear escaping her eye and tracking down her cheek. "I'm coming home." She slung her rifle over her back, sprinting toward the shattered glass of the balcony as the police helicopters began to circle outside. The sheepdog had protected her flock, and now, it was time to vanish back into the night. The rhythmic chopping of police helicopter blades battered the glass of the Emerald Tower's balcony. Red and blue strobe lights painted the Seattle night in frantic, overlapping sweeps. Inside the penthouse, the chaos was deafening: screams, sirens, and the frantic shouts of SWAT teams breaching the lower stairwells. Arthur Sterling was bleeding on the marble floor, his empire reduced to digital ash on the screens above him. Elizabeth Turner didn't look back. She sprinted toward the open balcony doors, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. There on the 78th floor. "Lizzie," Silas's voice crackled, tight with tension. "You have less than 30 seconds before they breach the penthouse. The extraction point is set." "I'm at the edge," Elizabeth said, vaulting over the glass railing. She stood on the narrow, 6-inch concrete ledge, 500 feet above the unforgiving pavement. Across the street, a lower, flat-roofed corporate building stood shrouded in darkness. From the small pouch on her lower back, she pulled out a pneumatic grappling launcher, a parting gift from Silas's armory. She aimed it at the heavy HVAC unit on the adjacent roof and pulled the trigger. With a sharp thwack, the titanium hook launched through the air, wrapping securely around the steel piping. She clipped the heavy-duty carabiner on her tactical harness to the high tensile line. "Hands in the air! Drop your weapons!" a voice roared from inside the ballroom. A SWAT team had just burst through the mahogany doors. Their assault rifles raised, laser sights sweeping through the dust and panic. Elizabeth looked over her shoulder at the heavily armed officers. She offered them a crisp, mock salute with her uninjured hand. Then, she stepped off the ledge. Gravity claimed her instantly. The wind roared in her ears as she plummeted, the zipline screaming in protest before catching her weight. She angled her body downward, descending at a terrifying speed across the dizzying urban canyon. She hit the adjacent roof hard, tucking her shoulder to absorb the impact and rolling across the gravel. She instantly unclipped the harness, leaving the line behind, and sprinted toward the roof access door. "Nice flying, Birdman," Silas chuckled over the comms. "There is a black motorcycle waiting in the alley below. The keys are in the ignition. Sterling's assets are frozen, and his hounds are scattering. You're clear. Lizzie, come home." Elizabeth found the stairwell and descended into the shadows. The sheepdog had completed her mission. It was time to return to her flock. 6 months later, the sun in Playa del Carmen didn't just shine, it embraced. It was a warm, golden blanket that smelled of sea salt, roasted agave, and blooming hibiscus. Elizabeth sat on a faded wooden deck chair, the toes of her bare feet buried in the warm, powdery white sand. She wore a simple white sundress, her hair tied back in a loose, carefree braid. A cool breeze rolled off the Caribbean Sea, gently rustling the palm fronds overhead. She raised a glass of freshly squeezed mango juice to her lips. Taking a slow sip, when she lowered her arm, the sunlight caught the thick, jagged scar running down her left bicep. It was a violent mark, a permanent reminder of a life she had traded away for blood. But she no longer tried to hide it. It was a medal of survival. "Mom, look." Elizabeth turned her head, down by the water's edge, where the turquoise waves gently lapped at the shore. Samuel was standing triumphantly next to a massive, slightly lopsided sandcastle. He was deeply tanned, wearing bright blue swimming trunks, and holding a plastic yellow shovel like a royal scepter. The fear that had once haunted his dark eyes was completely gone. The ghosts of the Oregon woods had been washed away by the tide, replaced by the boundless, vibrant energy of an 8-year-old boy who finally felt safe. "It's a fortress," Samuel yelled over the sound of the crashing waves. "It has a moat and everything. Nothing can get in." Elizabeth smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes and warmed her chest. "It looks impenetrable, buddy. The best fortress I've ever seen." A heavy set of footsteps crunched in the sand behind her. "Kid's got decent structural engineering skills," a deep, familiar voice rumbled. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She just tilted her head back as Silas Thorne stepped into her line of sight, carrying 2 cold bottles of local beer. He looked entirely out of place on a tropical beach, wearing khaki cargo shorts, a faded black t-shirt, and his trademark scowl. But he had kept his promise. He had wiped them off the map, created airtight new identities, and relocated his own retirement operation just a few miles down the coast to keep an eye on them. Silas handed her a bottle and sat down heavily in the chair next to hers. He looked out at the ocean, then down at Samuel playing in the surf. News out of Washington says the Intelligence Committee is still doing damage control. Silas muttered, taking a long pull from his beer. Sterling is facing life in federal prison for treason. The CIA is sweeping out the rest of his loyalists. You actually did it, Lizzie. You broke the machine. Elizabeth watched her son jump over a small wave, laughing as the water splashed his face. I didn't do it to save the world, Silas, she said softly, the ocean breeze catching her words. I did it to save him. I know, Silas said, a rare, genuine softness entering his rough voice. He clinked his bottle against hers. To echo 6. To the future, Elizabeth corrected, taking a sip of the cold beer. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes and letting the sun warm her face. There were no earpieces, no tactical vests, no shadows lurking in the corners of her mind. The war was over. The game was finished. Elizabeth Turner, the operative, the ghost, the killer, was finally dead. But Elizabeth, the mother, was very much alive, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be.